So what are the lessons learned from September 11th, and where do we stand in the war on terror? Joining the panel this week, Wall Street Journal columnist and deputy editor Dan Henninger, as well as Wall Street Journal editorial board members Dorothy Rabinowitz and Rob Pollack, and OpinionJournal.com columnist John Fund. Dan, looking across the last 5 years, what are the successes? What have we as a nation done right?
Well, I would say the answer to that is pretty simple. Virtually all of the anti-terror programs exposed on the front pages as an attack on our civil liberties have in fact been successful assaults on the terrorist attempt to destroy civilization. Let's go down the list. 1, electronic surveillance, the warrantless wiretaps. 2, the SWIFT program to monitor financial transactions. And 3, interring these homicidal people in Guantanamo. What all of that reflected, it seems to me, was Bush's success at getting the national security bureaucracies actively engaged in fighting terrorism rather than what we had before 9/11, which was a kind of passiveness to their strategies.
And that represents a conceptual change in how we fight this war, from the law enforcement mentality, which we used to treat it, where we took, remember after the first World Trade Center bombing, we didn't even bother to interrogate Ramzi Youssef, one of the plotters, very much. So it's a conceptual change too, Rob.
Yeah, it's a big conceptual change. It's not just these policies of interrogation and so forth that have been used against Al-Qaeda, but of course President Bush has taken a longer-term view as well, that we need to dry up these swamps where Islamic radicalism grows, which of course has brought us into Iraq and into Afghanistan, and that's the other big conceptual change.
The idea of going after state sponsors of terror, which we never did before.
Right.
We talked a little bit about it. We talked a good game against Iran or so on. But this time, actually, we've gone in and said, look, you will not have these refuges.
It's easy to focus on the bad news at this 5th-year anniversary, but I think we also have to focus on what has worked. If you'd asked people, and polls were taken right after 9/11, do you believe there'll be an attack on the American homeland the next few months or a year? 80% of the American people said yes. That hasn't happened. Obviously, that has something to do with the steps that Dan and others just mentioned.
Dorothy, on that point, we're hearing an argument made more and more now by people 5 years after, as memories fade, that somehow we overreacted as a nation to this event, that in fact it wasn't that great a threat, and as witnessed by the fact that we haven't been attacked. What's your response to that argument?
My response to that is to always go back to Winston Churchill, who's always good for a line or two on this. And he said most pointedly, the counsels of prudence and restraint led directly to the bullseye of disaster. And those are the truths here now, too. But you have to really look into what is the psychological impetus for babble about its overkill. Why is this? Because really, I do not think they want to acknowledge that Bush has been successful and that we have not had an attack of this kind.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah,
look, my response to people who say it wasn't as great a threat is, look, there was no surprise on September 11th about who this was. We didn't spend very long thinking, gee, who flew the planes into those buildings? Anyone who was following the news knew it was Osama bin Laden, knew it was Al-Qaeda. Why did we know that? We knew that because they'd hit the USS Cole in 2000, because they'd hit the African embassies in 1998, and because bin Laden kept going on TV and declaring jihad against the United States. I mean,
and also saying that the lack of a U.S. response emboldened them to try again.
Well, what about the progress against WMD? Because you have had Muammar Gaddafi turn state's evidence against himself and blew up his own WMD program. We rolled up the AQ Khan network, which is the Pakistani who was spreading WMD to places like North Korea and Iran. That is a significant change. We didn't have those successes before 9/11.
Yeah, and you know what, Paul? I think this actually points to the biggest question of all, and that's whether going into Iraq has been a success or a failure, whether it was a huge mistake. You know what? I think ultimately it was a success. What is the other biggest problem on the table right now? That is Iran's nuclear program. Clearly, the Iranians are seeking nuclear capability. If we had not gone into Iraq, if Saddam had been allowed to stay in power, and if he's watched Iran gaining nuclear capability, there is no question that he would have sought the same thing himself, rather than allow him to become under the foot of the Iranian mullahs.
But this issue of Iran, Iraq, and I would throw in Afghanistan too, are very unsettled at this point. We have not really won those conflicts yet. We still have a lot of nation building, if you can use that phrase, to do. We still have insurgencies in both places, a very active one in sectarian strife in Iraq, and then in Afghanistan, the Taliban is still a nuisance at the very least, John.
Well, I would submit we haven't paid enough attention to Afghanistan in the last few months. We've turned over about 90% of the territory of the country to NATO's troops, and they aren't doing the best job they could. I think we need to step up effort in Afghanistan.
The other thing I think it's important to remember is, as Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld himself pointed out in that famous memo, the war on terror is going to be a long, hard slog, and I think we have to be careful about having expectations that are too high.
Do you have, quickly, Rob, any second thoughts about going into these state-sponsored places and trying to replace the regimes?
No second thoughts at all. I think, as Dan said, there was not a benign alternative to going into Iraq.
Okay, all right, thanks. We'll continue our discussion in just a moment. Welcome back. We continue now with our panel. Dorothy, memories fade 5 years on. The war on terror, certainly Iraq, but also some of the methods the president has used and Dan described on the war on terror, very polarized and become very partisan. Are you concerned at all about the ability of us to maintain a domestic consensus as a nation to prosecute this war?
I think in the end, no. I think if you just look at a small portion of our existence today, going to the airports, and you view the ease with which Americans have accepted all of this surveillance, and I think the rest of it rolls off their backs. That is not to say that it is not important and damaging to hear the constant rain of assault about the death of our civil liberties for 5 years. I have immense faith in the American people's ability to toss that off, but that doesn't mean that when you poll them, they don't end up saying the right, the appropriate thing, thereby throwing the reality off.
But wait, we've had these divisions, and you know it has had an effect. The president's approval rating has fallen down below 40%. He has problems now. Paul, you had the opportunity this week to interview the president. You were on Air Force One with him, and you talked to him for nearly 45 minutes, I think. What was his mood? What was his attitude towards this?
Feisty, even passionate, not on defense at all, on offense in defending his policies, engaged in particular on the freedom agenda, the democracy agenda. When you asked him about Egypt, or you asked him about Iran, it was interesting to hear him talk about the details, get down below and take on the people who say, look, I think this is not going, people say this is not going well. He says, look, it's going to be a long war. There are growing pains, but here's the progress in Egypt, for example. Here's what I told Mubarak about the opposition leader. Here's what we're working on Iran. He's deeply engaged in these things, and I don't think that comes through an awful lot. And he's passionate about this argument. I think the speeches he gave this week, he wants to throw the gauntlet down for this
Well, he better do it
campaign.
in the next 60 days, because there's a poll that counts called the election.
That's right.
And if the Democrats take one or both houses of Congress, I have to tell you, I am very concerned the political consensus behind the war on terror is going to fray even more, and the president will be engaged in a political civil war in this country.
But John, the political consensus on Iraq is the thing you're talking about. But the political consensus called the war on terror, I think, is unshakably on the side of the president. They know. You just go to anybody in New York City who faced the ludicrousness of having objections to bag inspections, and 2 or 3 people who felt martyred, and my Lord.
Well, that's true, Dorothy, though. Why do the Democrats seem to think there's so much political mileage to be made in attacking the president on wiretapping, and attacking him on data mining, and attacking him on the interrogation policies?
And why do they lose elections?
There's a significant part of the Democratic Party which really does not believe that this was a major change. I mean, there's an article, a front page of Foreign Policy magazine this week says 9/11, the day nothing changed.
If the election is about the war on terror, Bush will have an advantage. But if the election is on Iraq, let's be honest here, the Republicans are in trouble because the country's unhappy.
I think one thing he could have done is spoken over the heads of the Democratic Party to Democratic voters. There are millions of them out there, and I think he, excuse me, needed to address their concerns directly rather than simply make them feel that his administration was ignoring them.
This brings to me the degree to which Iraq is the central issue in some respects here, because if we make progress there, so much of this domestic division will go away. If we win there, and then also things begin to open up throughout the Middle East, and we won't seem so beleaguered, and the sense in the last year of losing some momentum in the war on terror, and Iran, for example, reacting and saying, you're bogged down in Iraq, we can now push in Lebanon and other places. I think that would begin to fade if we can do better in Iraq. All right, thanks.